Signals from U.S. President Donald Trump about the possibility of Washington stepping back from its role as protector of the Strait of Hormuz have emerged at one of the most sensitive moments imaginable. Oil prices are surging, while the world's most critical energy shipping route is on the verge of paralysis. According to many assessments, this is no longer just a regional development. It is beginning to resemble a geopolitical shock that could ripple across the entire globe. Observers are now raising a warning question. Is the world moving closer to a modern-day version of the Suez Canal crisis? Analysts point out that Hormuz today holds a role strikingly similar to the Suez Canal in 1956, a strategic choke point where even the slightest disruption can trigger a chain reaction throughout the global economic system. As Iran gradually tightens its control over this route and transforms it into a geopolitical lever, while the United States signals a possible retreat, the security structure that has been maintained for decades is beginning to show visible cracks. Energy-dependent economies from Europe to Asia are being pushed into a passive position, not unlike the situation the West once faced after Egypt's decision to nationalize the Suez Canal nearly 7 decades ago. At its core, as many experts emphasize, this is not just about military conflict. It is about the true limits of power. As the U.S. considers scaling back its role as the guarantor of global maritime security, the entire system faces the risk of being reshaped into one where no single superpower is capable of unilaterally controlling the world's strategic choke points. As fractures begin to appear in maritime security, developments on the ground reveal that the conflict has moved beyond symbolic military strikes and is shifting toward a far more dangerous front: energy warfare. Iran is no longer responding solely with missiles or drones. Instead, it is targeting the core vulnerabilities of the global system: oil fields, gas facilities, and critical energy infrastructure. This is not a random choice, but a calculated strategy. Once energy facilities become targets, the impact is no longer confined within national borders. It spreads globally, following the very logic of globalization itself, where every economy is interconnected through energy flows. Experts argue that in a world deeply dependent on oil and gas, attacking energy infrastructure is equivalent to striking the circulatory system of the global economy. A disruption in the Middle East can quickly translate into inflation in Europe, energy crises in Asia, and financial instability across global markets. In this context, war is no longer a conflict between 2 or 3 nations. It becomes a systemic phenomenon. In other words, once energy becomes a weapon, a regional war almost inevitably produces global consequences. What is equally striking is that this escalation is happening alongside another strategy from the U.S. and Israel, targeting Iran's top leadership. These targeted assassination campaigns were expected to paralyze Iran's command structure, create internal chaos, and force Tehran into concessions. However, reality has taken a completely different trajectory. Iran's political system has not collapsed. Instead, it has demonstrated remarkable resilience. Vacant positions are quickly filled, and more importantly, successors often adopt even harder-line stances than their predecessors. Analysts see this as a classic example of the failure of so-called decapitation strategies in highly ideological political systems. In such systems, power is not concentrated in a single individual, but distributed across an organized structure bound by strong beliefs. Removing a leader does not weaken the system. It can instead trigger defensive reactions, strengthen internal cohesion, and empower more hardline factions. In other words, each assassination is not just an attack. It becomes a catalyst that hardens the system even further. The consequence of this shift is clearly reflected in how Iran conducts its war. Rather than seeking an unlikely direct military victory against the superior forces of the US and Israel, Tehran has chosen a different path, maximizing the cost of war for its opponents. And within this strategy, the Strait of Hormuz emerges as a decisive card. Hormuz is not a battlefield in the traditional sense, yet it determines the entire outcome of the conflict. A significant portion of the world's oil supply passes through this narrow choke point, making it one of the most critical arteries of the global economy. In this context, Iran does not need to win on the battlefield. Simply controlling or disrupting the flow through Hormuz is enough to create immense pressure on its adversaries. Recent data shows that shipping traffic through the region has already declined sharply, reflecting rising risks and growing caution among transport companies. Even a slight increase in insurance costs or the mere threat of attack can force a complete revaluation of the global energy transport system. This leads to a crucial reality. Power in modern conflict is no longer measured by the number of soldiers or weapons, but by the ability to control flows of energy, trade, and finance. From this perspective, Hormuz is no longer just a shipping route. It has become a true geopolitical weapon. Iran is leveraging its geographic position to transform military disadvantages into strategic advantages. Instead of direct confrontation, it is tightening control over critical flows, an indirect yet highly effective approach, especially in an interconnected world. Many experts argue that this represents a fundamental shift in how power is understood. In the past, controlling territory was key. Today, controlling logistics, supply chains, and strategic choke points is what truly matters. A country no longer needs to occupy land to exert influence. It only needs to control the system's bottlenecks to shape the behavior of others. In this context, the combination of energy warfare, the failure of assassination strategies, and the weaponization of Hormuz is creating a new spiral of escalation. This is no longer a simple confrontation between nations. It is a stress test of globalization itself, where connections once seen as strengths are now vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. And at this intersection, a deeper question emerges. If strategic choke points like Hormuz can be weaponized, does the current global system still have the ability to protect itself? Or are we entering an era where power belongs not to those who control the most territory, but to those who control the world's flows? While Iran maximizes its geographic advantage to weaponize energy flows, signals from President Trump suggest an even deeper shift. Washington may no longer be willing to act as the ultimate guarantor of global security. The message goes beyond military concerns. It carries clear economic and political implications. Countries benefiting from the flow through Hormuz, from China to Europe to the Gulf states, may now have to share the burden of protecting their own interests. What is unfolding today echoes the Suez Canal crisis, one of the defining turning points of the 20th century. Back then, the canal was also a strategic choke point where economic interests, geopolitical ambitions, and great power interventions collided. Britain and France, despite their military superiority, were forced to withdraw, not because of battlefield defeat, but due to pressure from larger power structures, particularly the US and the Soviet Union. Today, Hormuz mirrors many of those same dynamics. It is not just a route for oil, it is a convergence point of global interests. The US has security interests, China has energy interests, Europe has economic interests, and Gulf nations have existential interests. When all these forces converge in a narrow space, even a minor disruption can trigger a chain reaction, forcing major powers to intervene, whether they want to or not. Therefore, Hormuz should not be seen merely as a regional crisis. It is a test of how the global order functions during a period of transition. If the U.S. truly scales back its role, the world may move toward a multipolar structure, where responsibility is more distributed, but stability is far less certain. On the other hand, without a strong replacement mechanism, a more dangerous scenario emerges: energy chaos, where strategic choke points are exploited as tools of pressure, destabilizing the entire system. At the end of this unfolding chain of events, Hormuz is no longer just an oil transit route. It has become a measure of power, a place where the most fundamental question of our time is laid bare: who truly controls the flow of the world, and at what cost?